Professor Zyx'nax stood before his class of interspecies students, his tentacles quivering with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Today was Bring Your Pet to Class Day at the Galactic University of Xenobiology, and he couldn't wait to see what fascinating creatures his students would present. Little did he know, the humans in his class were about to turn his perfectly organized lesson plan into a circus of chaos and terror. "All right, class," Zyx'nax warbled, his voice oscillating between octaves like a drunk opera singer on a roller coaster. "Today we'll be examining the diverse array of companion species from across the galaxy. Who would like to go first?" A Floridian human named Chad raised his hand, grinning like he'd just won a year's supply of beer and alligator jerky. "I'll go, Prof. Meet my little buddy, Chompy." With a flourish that would make a stage magician jealous, Chad whipped off a covering to reveal a container holding an alligator. A very angry, very bitey alligator. Zyx'nax's eye stalks nearly popped out of his head. "Great galaxies. Is that a Terran apex predator?" Chad laughed, slapping his knee as if Zyx'nax had just told the funniest joke in the universe. "Nah, man. This is just a baby. You should see his mama. Now that's an apex predator." The class erupted into a cacophony of shrieks, squeals, and what sounded suspiciously like prayers to various deities. The Arcturian delegation promptly fainted, their delicate sensibilities overwhelmed by the sight of Chompy's gnashing teeth. But Zyx'nax sputtered, his tentacles tying themselves into knots. The assignment was to bring a pet, a domesticated companion animal. Chad looked genuinely confused. "Yeah, and Chompy here is as domesticated as they come. Watch this, Chompy, roll over." To everyone's astonishment and horror, the alligator actually rolled over. Of course, in doing so, it smashed its tail against the container, sending cracked spiderwebbing across the surface. See, Chad beamed proudly. "He's a good boy." Zyx'nax made a mental note to update the university's insurance policy, and possibly his will. As the class collectively held their breath, those species that breathed anyway, a quiet voice spoke up from the back. Professor? May I present my pet next?" It was Li Wei, a soft-spoken student from China. Zyx'nax, desperate for something, anything, less terrifying than Chompy, eagerly nodded. "Yes, please. Show us your gentle, harmless pet." Li Wei smiled serenely and lifted a small, ornate box onto her desk. "This is Fang," she said, opening the lid. The class leaned in, curious. What emerged was a spider. A very large, very hairy spider. "By the cosmic egg," shrieked Thorak, a normally stoic Rigelian. "It's a monster." Li Wei looked offended. "Fang is not a monster. He is a Chinese bird-eating spider, and he is a perfect gentleman." As if to prove her point, Fang delicately crawled onto Li Wei's hand, its 8 legs moving with surprising grace for something that looked like it could star in its own horror movie. Zyx'nax, who was seriously considering a career change to something less stressful, like bomb disposal or political journalism in war zones, cleared his throat. "Ah yes, very interesting. Does it actually eat birds?" Li Wei nodded enthusiastically. "Oh yes. Would you like a demonstration? I brought some sparrows." The collective shout from the class and a particularly high-pitched yelp from Zyx'nax cut her off. "Maybe later," Li Wei said, looking slightly disappointed as she returned Fang to his box. Zyx'nax took a deep breath, reminding himself that he was a professional educator and not, despite all evidence to the contrary, the ringmaster of some demented cosmic circus. Right, who's next? And please, for the love of all that's holy in this universe, tell me it's not another human. A tentative hand rose from the middle of the class. It belonged to Glix Boar, a gelatinous being from the swamp planet Macoria. Zyx'nax nearly wept with relief. Finally, a nice, safe, non-Terran pet. "Yes, Glix Boar. Please, show us your pet." Glix Boar burbled happily and produced a small aquarium filled with mud. Just mud. Zyx'nax blinked all 7 of his eyes. "Where's the pet?" Right here," Glix Boar exclaimed, pointing at the mud. "This is Squish, my beloved mud puppy." The class peered at the aquarium. The mud remained resolutely mud-like. "It's very nice," Zyx'nax said weakly, wondering if he was finally losing his mind. "What does it do?" Glix Boar looked offended. "Do? Squish doesn't need to do anything. Squish is. Isn't that enough?" Before Zyx'nax could formulate a response that wouldn't offend either Glix Boar or the mud, a booming voice cut through the classroom. "Oh, my turn, Yagalas." It was Bruce, the Australian exchange student. Zyx'nax felt a chill run down his spine, all 3 of them. He'd heard rumors about Australian wildlife. Bruce swaggered to the front of the class, carrying what looked like a small sack. "All right, you lot, say G-Day to my little mate, Bitey." With a flourish that would make a rodeo clown proud, Bruce upended the sack. Out tumbled a ball of fur, claws, and barely contained rage. "What in the name of the cosmic void is that?" screeched Zyx'nax, leaping onto his desk with surprising agility for a being with no legs. Bruce looked at him like he'd grown a second head, which, for some species in the class, wouldn't have been that unusual. "It's a drop bear, of course." Raised him from a joey I did. The drop bear unfurled itself, revealing a koala-like creature. But where normal koalas look cute and cuddly, this one had the eyes of a demon and claws that looked like they could shred battleship armor. But stammered Zyx'nax. I thought drop bears were just a myth, a tale told to scare tourists. Bruce threw back his head and laughed, a sound that managed to be both jovial and terrifying. That's what we want you to think. Mate. Keeps the population under control, ya see. The drop bear, apparently annoyed at being the center of attention, let out a roar that should not have been possible from a creature its size. Half the class dove under their desks. The other half seemed frozen in terror. Now, Bitey, Bruce chided, seemingly oblivious to the pandemonium around him. No need to show off. Here, have a eucalyptus leaf. He pulled out a leaf from his pocket and held it out. Bitey's demeanor changed instantly. It grabbed the leaf with surprising gentleness and began munching contentedly. See, Bruce said proudly. Harmless as a lamb he is. Zyx'nax, still perched on his desk, made a mental note to look up what a lamb was and whether it was as terrifying as everything else he'd seen today. Just as the class was beginning to calm down, or at least downgrade from blind panic to severe anxiety, another voice piped up. Excuse me, Professor, I haven't presented my pet yet. It was Maria, a student from Brazil. Zyx'nax looked at her pleadingly. Please, he begged, please tell me it's something small and harmless. A fish, perhaps, or a rock. Maria smiled reassuringly. Oh, don't worry, Professor. Fluffy is very well behaved. She reached into her bag and pulled out a snake. A very large, very colorful snake? Holy hydrogen, exclaimed Zyx'nax, his tentacles curling in shock. Is that a constricting serpent? Maria nodded proudly. Yes, Fluffy is a rainbow boa. Isn't she beautiful? The snake, apparently enjoying being the center of attention, flicked its tongue out, tasting the air. The iridescent scales shimmered in the classroom lights, creating a mesmerizing display of colors. But Zyx'nax stammered, isn't it dangerous? Maria laughed, a sound that was halfway between amusement and exasperation. Only if you're a small mammal or bird. To us, she's a perfect pet. Watch this. Before anyone could stop her, Maria draped the snake around her shoulders like a scaly, living scarf. Fluffy seemed perfectly content, curling gently around Maria's neck. See, totally harmless. The class watched in a mixture of horror and fascination. The Arcturians, who had just regained consciousness, promptly fainted again. Zyx'nax, who was seriously considering joining the Arcturians in blissful unconsciousness, cleared his throat. Yes, well, very interesting, Maria. Perhaps you could, put Fluffy back in her container now. As Maria complied, cooing softly to her serpentine pet, Zyx'nax turned to address the class, hoping against hope that the parade of Terran terror was over. Now then, does anyone else have a pet to present? Preferably something that doesn't eat other animals, isn't venomous, and won't give me nightmares for the next solar cycle. A shy hand rose from the back of the class. It belonged to Yuki, a quiet student from Japan. Zyx'nax felt a glimmer of hope. Surely the culturally refined Japanese wouldn't bring something as outrageous as their fellow humans. Yes, Yuki. What delightful creature have you brought to share with us today? Yuki smiled softly and reached into her bag. This is Pochi, she said, pulling out a dog. Zyx'nax almost cried with relief. Finally, a normal pet, a classic companion animal, known throughout the galaxy for its loyalty and gentleness. The dog was small, with a fox-like face and pointy ears. It looked around the classroom curiously, its tail wagging slightly. Oh, how wonderful, Zyx'nax exclaimed, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically. A canine companion. These are well known across the galaxy as faithful and gentle pets. Class, observe how calm and well-behaved this animal is compared to, well, everything else we've seen today. The class collectively leaned forward, eager to see a normal pet after the parade of terror they'd witnessed. Yuki nodded, still smiling. Yes, Poki is very well behaved. He's a Shiba Inu, a breed known for its loyalty, and she paused, her smile turning slightly mischievous. Its strong personality. Before anyone could question what she meant by strong personality, Pochi locked eyes with Chompy the alligator. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, all hell broke loose. With a bark that sounded more like a battle cry, Poki launched himself off Yuki's desk, sailing through the air with all the grace and fury of a furry missile. His target, Chompy's container. Pochi, no, Yuki cried, but it was too late. The Shiba Inu hit the alligator's container with enough force to send it teetering. For one heart-stopping moment, it looked like it might stay upright. Then, almost in slow motion, it toppled over. The already cracked container shattered upon impact with the floor. Chompy, evidently deciding that freedom was preferable to captivity, burst forth with a triumphant roar. Chaos erupted. Students scattered in all directions, their screams creating a symphony of terror. The Arcturians, having just regained consciousness for the second time, took one look at the unfolding disaster and decided that a third fainting spell was the best course of action. Chad, displaying either incredible bravery or monumental stupidity, the line between the two often being blurry when it came to Floridians, dove after Chompy. Come back, buddy, he yelled, narrowly avoiding the alligator's snapping jaws. Meanwhile, Pochi, apparently satisfied with the havoc he'd wrought, calmly trotted back to Yuki and sat at her feet, looking for all the world like the most innocent creature in the universe. Yuki scooped him up, a mix of exasperation and amusement on her face. "Gomenasai," she said to the class at large. "Pochi can be a bit mischievous sometimes." Mischievous, Zyx'nax thought hysterically, is not the word I would use to describe a creature that just released an apex predator into my classroom. But the chaos was far from over. Chompy, reveling in his newfound freedom, made a beeline for Li Wei's desk. With one sweep of his powerful tail, he knocked over the box containing Fang the bird-eating spider. Li Wei gasped in horror as Fang scuttled out, his 8 legs carrying him across the classroom floor with alarming speed. "Fang, come back," she cried, diving after her arachnid companion. The sight of a giant spider racing across the floor was too much for some of the more arachnophobic students. Screams reached a new pitch as they scrambled to get on top of their desks, chairs, or each other, anything to get away from the terrifying 8-legged menace. Bruce, seeing the unfolding disaster, decided that what the situation really needed was more Australian wildlife. "No worries, mates," he shouted over the din. "Bite'll sort this out." Before anyone could stop him, not that anyone was in a position to do so, what with the alligator and spider situation, Bruce released his drop bear. Bitey, living up to his name, immediately latched onto the nearest vertical surface, which happened to be Glixbor's gelatinous form. Glixbor let out a burbling shriek of surprise and started spinning in place, trying to dislodge the coal-eyed creature. In the process, Glixbor knocked over his own aquarium. Mud spilled across the floor, creating a slippery hazard that sent several fleeing students sliding into walls or each other. Squish, Glixbor wailed, momentarily forgetting about the drop bear attached to his midsection. "Come back." The mud, unsurprisingly, did not respond to this plea. It did, however, continue to spread across the classroom floor, creating an ever-expanding zone of slippery chaos. Amidst all this, Maria's rainbow boa, Fluffy, decided that all the commotion was simply too interesting to ignore. With a grace that belied its size, it slithered out of its container and joined the fray. "Fluffy, no," Maria cried, diving after her serpentine pet. "This isn't playtime." Fluffy, evidently disagreeing with this assessment, continued its exploration of the classroom. Its colorful scales shimmered as it moved, creating a beautiful yet terrifying spectacle as it weaved between the legs of panicking students. Zyx'nax, still perched atop his desk, watched the unfolding catastrophe with a mixture of horror and fascination. His 7 eyes darted from one disaster to another, unsure where to focus in this maelstrom of mayhem. "This can't be happening," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of screams, barks, hisses, and what he could only assume was the sound of his academic career going down the drain. "I should have listened to my third mother and become a quantum entanglement engineer, but I just had to follow my passion for xenobiology." Meanwhile, Chad was still in hot pursuit of Chompy the alligator, who had decided that the classroom's water cooler looked like a lovely swamp to call home. With a mighty leap that would have made an Olympic long jumper green with envy, Chompy crashed into the cooler, sending a tidal wave of water across the already chaotic classroom. "Chompy, you sly dog," Chad laughed, seemingly oblivious to the fact that his pet was now snapping at the ankles of his terrified classmates. "I knew you missed the swamp, but this is taking it a bit far, don't you think?" The sudden influx of water turned the muddy floor into a veritable slip and slide. Students who had managed to keep their footing thus far suddenly found themselves performing impromptu ice skating routines, minus the grace and plus a hefty dose of panic. Glixbor, still spinning like a gelatinous top with Bitey the drop bear attached, slid across the room, leaving a trail of muddy slime in his wake. "Someone, please," he gurgled. "I don't know how much more of this I can take." Bruce, displaying the unflappable nature that Australians were famous for, simply shrugged at the chaos. Reminds me of a typical Tuesday back home," he mused, casually sidestepping a flailing tentacle from one of his alien classmates. Meanwhile, Li Wei had cornered Fang the bird-eating spider, or so she thought. Just as she was about to scoop him up, Fluffy the rainbow boa slithered by, startling her. Li Wei stumbled backwards, arms windmilling wildly, before landing with a splash in the newly formed swamp that Chompy was happily exploring. "Ah," Li Wei exclaimed, spitting out a mouthful of water. "This is not how I imagined my presentation going." Fang, seizing the opportunity, scuttled up the wall and onto the ceiling, causing a fresh wave of panic among the students below. Those who weren't already pressed against the walls now huddled in the center of the room, forming a tight circle with their backs to each other, eyes darting wildly in every direction. "Don't panic," Maria shouted, trying to restore some semblance of order. "Fluffy won't hurt anyone. She's just curious." Her attempts at reassurance fell on deaf ears as Fluffy, living up to her curious nature, began to investigate the huddled group of students. Her forked tongue flicked in and out, tasting the air around the terrified aliens. One particularly brave, or perhaps just frozen in fear, Zentaurian student found himself face to face with Fluffy. The rainbow boa tilted her head, seemingly fascinated by the Zentaurian's shimmering scales, which weren't too dissimilar from her own. "See," Maria said, a note of pride in her voice. Fluffy's just making friends. The Zentorian, to his credit, managed a weak smile. Yes, he stammered. Wonderful. See, could you please call your friend back now? Yuki, who had been trying to calm Pochi down, suddenly realized that her Shiba Inu was no longer by her side. Pochi, she called out, her voice tinged with worry. Where are you? A series of sharp, defiant barks answered her question. Pochi had somehow managed to climb onto one of the higher shelves and was now engaged in a barking match with Bitey the drop bear, who had finally detached from Glick's boar only to find himself trapped on an equally high perch. Oi, Bitey, Bruce called out. Play nice with the little fella. Bitey responded with a growl that sounded decidedly unplayful. Zyx'nax, still on his desk, had gone from panic to resigned. He watched as his carefully planned lesson descended further into madness, a hysterical laugh bubbling up from somewhere deep inside him. You know, he said to no one in particular, his voice taking on a slightly manic edge, when I was studying to become a professor, they never covered this scenario in Classroom Management 101. I wonder why. Just then, a loud crash echoed through the room. All eyes, those not squeezed shut in terror, anyway turned to see Chompy the alligator, who had apparently decided that the classroom's aquarium would make a lovely addition to his new swamp. With one sweep of his powerful tail, he had sent it crashing to the ground. Water, fish, and decorative pebbles spilled across the floor, adding to the already impressive indoor swamp. The fish, far from being distressed, seemed to be enjoying their newfound freedom, darting between the legs of students and other animals alike. Chad beamed with pride. Would you look at that? Chompy's redecorating. He's got a real eye for interior design, don't you think? Zyx'nax, beyond the point of shock, simply nodded. Oh yes, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Simply marvelous. I especially like how the fish complement the mud. It really ties the room together, don't you think? Chad, missing the sarcasm entirely, nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. You've got a good eye, Prof. Meanwhile, the Arcturians, who had been unconscious for most of the chaos, began to stir once more. As their eyes fluttered open, they were greeted by the sight of Fang the bird-eating spider descending from the ceiling on a silken thread, directly above them. Their screams reached a pitch that threatened to shatter what remained of the classroom's windows. In their panic, they scrambled to their feet, slipped on the muddy floor, and went sliding across the room like a row of screaming, alien bowling pins. They collided with a group of Voltarans, who had been huddled in a corner, their bioluminescent skin flashing in distress patterns. The impact sent both groups tumbling, creating a tangle of limbs, tentacles, and flashing lights that looked like some sort of demented alien disco ball. Glick's boar, who had finally managed to regain his composure and his shape, looked at the muddy swamp that now covered most of the classroom floor. You know, he burbled thoughtfully. I think Squish is actually enjoying this. I've never seen him so spread out before. Indeed, the mud that had once been confined to Glick's boar's small aquarium now covered a significant portion of the room. And was it just Zyx'nax's imagination, or did the mud seem to be pulsating slightly? Great, Zyx'nax muttered. Not only do I have to deal with Terran monsters, but now I've got sentient mud to worry about. What's next? Will the chairs come to life and start dancing? As if on cue, Pochi the Shiba Inu, having tired of his barking match with Bitey, leaped from his high perch. His trajectory took him straight towards Zyx'nax's desk, the one island of stability in the chaotic sea the classroom had become. Zyx'nax's eyes widened in horror. No, he cried, but it was too late. Pochi landed on the desk with all the grace of a canine missile. The impact sent both dog and professor tumbling into the muddy waters below. Zyx'nax emerged from the muck, sputtering and flailing his tentacles. Pochi, seemingly quite pleased with himself, began to happily splash around in the water. I give up, Zyx'nax announced to the class at large, though it was doubtful anyone was listening at this point. Class dismissed. Forever. I'm going to tender my resignation and move to a nice, quiet neutron star where I'll never have to deal with Terran pets ever again. But the chaos was far from over. Chompy, perhaps feeling that his new swamp lacked a certain je ne sais quoi, had set his sights on the class terrarium. The large glass enclosure housed a variety of alien plants, some of which moved on their own and others that emitted soft bioluminescent glows. With a powerful swipe of his tail, Chompy sent the terrarium crashing to the ground. Soil, plants, and small alien insects spilled out, adding to the already impressive ecosystem developing on the classroom floor. Chompy, you sly dog, Chad exclaimed, beaming with pride. Look at you, reintroducing endangered species into the wild. You're a regular conservationist. Li Wei, who had been attempting to coax Fang down from his ceiling perch with limited success, turned to stare at Chad in disbelief. Your alligator is destroying the classroom, and you think he's doing conservation work. Chad shrugged, his grin never faltering. Well, when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. When life gives you a flooded classroom, you make a nature preserve. As if to punctuate Chad's point, one of the newly liberated plants, a carnivorous species from the swamps of Ventrix IV, began to slither across the floor. snapping at anything that moved. Several students shrieked and scrambled to higher ground, which at this point meant perching precariously on any desk or chair that wasn't already submerged. Fluffy the rainbow boa, intrigued by this new arrival, slithered over to investigate. The two creatures engaged in what could only be described as a reptile-plant standoff, each sizing up the other with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Oh no," Maria murmured, watching the scene unfold. "Fluffy, be careful. That's not a new friend." But Fluffy, it seemed, had other ideas. Quick as a flash, she wrapped herself around the carnivorous plant, constricting it before it could snap at her. The plant writhed for a moment before going limp, apparently deciding that playing dead was its best option. Maria blinked in surprise. "Who?" she said, a note of pride creeping into her voice. "I guess those mouse hunting skills translate well to alien flora." Meanwhile, Bruce had finally managed to recapture Bitey the drop bear, who was now clinging to his arm with a grip that suggested he had no intention of letting go anytime soon. "There's a good lad," Bruce cooed, seemingly oblivious to the fact that Bitey's claws were digging into his skin. "See? He's just a big softy once you get to know him." The rest of the class, still huddled on whatever dry surfaces they could find, looked at Bruce with a mixture of awe and concern for his mental health. Yuki had finally managed to corral Pochi, who was now sitting obediently at her feet, looking for all the world like he hadn't just caused a classroom apocalypse. "Gamanasai, Professor," she said, bowing deeply to Zyx'nax, who was still standing waist-deep in the muddy water. "Poki gets excited sometimes." Zyx'nax stared at her for a long moment, his tentacles drooping in defeat. "Excited," he repeated flatly. "Yes, I can see that. Tell me, is this normal for Terran pets?" The human students exchanged glances before nodding in unison. "Oh yeah, totally normal," Chad said, still trying to lure Chompy back into his container with what looked suspiciously like a ham sandwich. "You should see what happens when we celebrate holidays." Zyx'nax felt a shudder run through all three of his spines. "Holidays," he muttered. "Right, remind me to schedule my vacation time accordingly." Just then, a loud gurgling sound emanated from the muddy waters. All eyes turned to see a large bubble forming in the center of the room. It grew larger and larger, quivering ominously. Glixbor's eyes widened in recognition. "Oh no," he burbled. "I think Squish is about to." He never got to finish his sentence. The bubble burst with a sound like a wet explosion, sending a tidal wave of mud in all directions. Students who had managed to stay relatively clean until now found themselves covered head to toe or tentacle to pseudopod in thick, goopy mud. Reproduced Glixbor finished unnecessarily, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. "Squish has never done that before. I think he likes it here." Indeed, where there had been one large mud puddle, there were now several smaller ones, each quivering with what could only be described as muddy glee. Zyx'nax, now completely covered in mud, closed all 7 of his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, he fixed his gaze on the human students, who were looking around at the devastation with expressions ranging from sheepish to outright proud. "Well," Zyx'nax said, his voice eerily calm, "I believe we've had quite the educational experience today. Would anyone care to summarize what we've learned about Terran pets?" The class fell silent, the only sounds being the occasional splash from Chompy, the contented hiss of Fluffy, and the happy burbling of the newly multiplied Squish. Finally, it was Li Wei who spoke up. Fang the bird-eating spider now perched contentedly on her shoulder. "I think," she said slowly, "we've learned that Terran pets are unpredictable, adaptable, and perhaps a bit more lively than the average galactic pet." Chad nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, and don't forget loyal, fun, and great at redecorating." Bruce chimed in, still cradling Bitey too right. "They're always keeping you on your toes. Life's never boring with a Terran pet around." Maria, who had managed to coax Fluffy back into her container, added, "They're also great conversation starters. I mean, look at how much interaction we've had today." Yuki, ever the diplomat, bowed again to Zyx'nax. "What we're trying to say, Professor, is that while our pets may be a bit overwhelming at times, they're also a reflection of the diversity and resilience of Earth's ecosystems. They help us connect with nature and with each other." Zyx'nax looked around at the devastated classroom, the muddy swamp that now covered the floor, the overturned desks, the cowering alien students, and the proudly beaming humans. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose that's one way to look at it. I would also add destructive, terrifying, and capable of turning a perfectly normal classroom into a xenobiologist's fever dream to that list." He paused, then added with a hint of grudging admiration, "But I must admit, I've never seen such enthusiasm from a group of students before. Perhaps there's something to be said for the Terran approach to companionship after all." The human students beamed with pride. Now Zyx'nax continued, straightening up as much as one can while standing in a muddy swamp. "I believe our next order of business is to figure out how to turn this classroom back into, well, a classroom. Any volunteers?" The humans exchanged glances, then raised their hands in unison, their pets mimicking the gesture in their own unique ways, Chompy raising his snout. Fang lifting a leg, Bitey extending a paw, Fluffy raising her head, Pokey wagging his tail, and Squish. Well, Squish just kept on bubbling happily. Zyx'nax sighed, a sound that somehow managed to convey both exasperation and a newfound respect. Very well, he said. Let's get to work. And perhaps, while we clean, you can tell me more about these unique companions of yours. I have a feeling there's much more to learn. And so, the great classroom cleanup began. It was a sight to behold, humans and aliens working side by side, with the occasional help from their Terran pets. Chad had finally managed to lure Chompy back into a new, sturdier container, bribing him with what appeared to be an entire roast chicken. You know, he said as he scrubbed algae off a desk, Chompy here is actually great at keeping the mosquito population down back home. Maybe we could market him as an eco-friendly pest control solution. Zyx'nax, who was attempting to mop up the muddy water with his tentacles, paused to stare at Chad. Are you suggesting we unleash alligators across the galaxy as a form of pest control? Chad grinned. Why not? It's organic. Before Zyx'nax could formulate a response to this terrifying proposal, Li Wei chimed in. She was carefully collecting the scattered plants from the destroyed terrarium, with Fang helpfully carrying smaller specimens on his back. Perhaps a less bitey solution might be more universally accepted, she suggested diplomatically. Fang here is an excellent pest controller too. He keeps my apartment free of insects, and he's much easier to house than an alligator. Several of the alien students who were cautiously emerging from their hiding spots to help with the cleanup blanched at the idea of voluntarily keeping a giant spider in one's living space. Bruce, who was using Bitey as a living mop the drop bear, seemed oddly content with this arrangement, nodded in agreement. Too right. Back home, we've got all sorts of critters that help keep the ecosystem in balance. It's all about finding the right beastie for the job. Maria, who was helping Fluffy clean up by allowing her to slither through the puddles, collecting debris in her coils, added her thoughts. It's not just about pest control, though. These animals are part of our lives, our families. They teach us responsibility, compassion, and how to coexist with nature. Yuki nodded, directing Pochi to fetch scattered items with surprising efficiency. Exactly. Pochi here has taught me patience, unconditional love, and the importance of regular exercise, she said with a laugh as Pochi zoomed past with a Saudi textbook in his mouth. Glix Boar, who was attempting to convince the multiplied Squish to merge back into a single entity, burbled in agreement. I think I understand. Your pets are not just animals, but partners in your journey through life. They challenge you, support you. And sometimes he paused as one of the Squish blobs playfully engulfed his foot. ... surprise you. Zyx'nax looked around the classroom. Despite the ongoing chaos, or perhaps because of it, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. The human students were working seamlessly with their alien classmates, their shared task bridging cultural and biological gaps. Even the most timid alien students were cautiously interacting with the Terran pets, their initial fear giving way to curiosity. You know, Zyx'nax said, a note of wonder in his voice, I think I'm beginning to understand. Your pets, as terrifying as they may be, serve as a bridge. They connect you to your world, and now they're connecting you to the galaxy. Chad beamed, giving Chompy's container a fond pat. That's it, Prof, you're getting it. Although Zyx'nax added hastily, I think we might need to implement some additional safety protocols before our next Bring Your Pet to Class day. The humans laughed, a sound echoed in various ways by their pets, Chompy's low rumble, Fang's leg rubbing stridulation, Bitey's grumble, Fluffy's hiss, Pochi's bark, and Squish's burble. Lay. As the classroom gradually transformed back into a recognizable learning space, albeit one with a few more mud stains and claw marks than before, Zyx'nax found himself reflecting on the day's events. Yes, it had been chaotic. Yes, there had been moments of sheer terror. And yes, he would definitely be speaking to the administration about upgrading the classroom's insurance policy. But there had also been moments of surprising beauty, of interspecies cooperation, and of learning that went far beyond any lesson plan he could have devised. Well, he said finally, addressing the class as they put the finishing touches on their cleaning efforts, I believe it's safe to say that this has been the most memorable class in my teaching career. The students, human and alien alike, grinned at him. And while I'm not sure I'm quite ready to adopt a Terran pet of my own, he continued, eyeing Chompy's container warily, I must admit that I've gained a new appreciation for Earth's biodiversity and the unique bonds you formed with these creatures. He paused, his eye stalk swiveling as he took in the scene before him, humans and aliens standing side by side, their Terran pets and one very excited blob of mud scattered among them. Perhaps, he said thoughtfully, there's a lesson here for all of us about adaptation, coexistence, and the unexpected ways we can learn from each other. After all, if a classroom can survive an alligator, a giant spider, a drop bear, a rainbow boa, a shiba inu, and sentient mud, well, I'd say the future of interspecies cooperation looks bright indeed. The class erupted in cheers, roars, barks, and burbles of agreement. Now Zyx'nax said, clapping his tentacles together, who's ready for next week's lesson on interstellar parasites? The humans exchanged excited glances, their eyes gleaming with possibilities. Zyx'nax felt a moment of panic as he realized what he'd just said. On second thought, he added hastily, "Perhaps we'll stick to a nice, safe lecture. No show and tell this time." As the class laughed and began to file out, their pets in tow, Zyx'nax couldn't help but smile. It had been a day of chaos, terror, and more than a few near disasters. But it had also been a day of discovery, of breaking down barriers, and of forging new connections. And really, he mused as he watched Chad attempt to maneuver Chompy's container through the door. Isn't that what education is all about? With a shake of his head and a fond chuckle, Zyx'nax began to plan his next lesson. Something told him that teaching this particular group of students was going to be the adventure of a lifetime. As the last student left the room, Zyx'nax looked down to see one of Squish's offspring bubbling happily at his feet. With only a moment's hesitation, he reached down and patted it gently. "Well, little one," he said softly, "I suppose you can stay. After all, every teacher needs a class pet, right?" The mud blob burbled in agreement, and Zyx'nax felt the last of his reservations melt away. Life with Terrans and their pets would never be boring, that was for sure. But then again, he thought with a smile, boring was overrated anyway. And so, as the sun set on the Galactic University of Xenobiology, a new chapter began, one filled with scaly, furry, eight-legged, and muddy adventures. The galaxy would never be the same, and neither would Zyx'nax. And honestly, he wouldn't have it any other way.